we'll get it done over the spring break.
Yeah. So yeah.
Something I want. You got any ideas?
Yeah. I think if anything, I will. My kid's been through whatever I need. So.
Oh, cool. Does your friend have one?
Yeah.
Your son? Your friend? Hi, everybody. Hope everybody's doing okay back there. I'm just getting my headphones going. I see one of you out there, so it's great. Here, I can show you what I've been on lately. One thing I'm going to get done over the spring break is this is a chimpanzee skull. It doesn't look like much at all, but it's the back of the skull. I've been using our 3D printer, which we have over here, and I've been printing some 3D things, so pretty pumped about that. So at the very least, I'll get something useful done for the break. So hopefully you'll come back to school and be able to handle a full-size version of that. So that's this is the same skull, I believe, but well, I guess it looked like this. We did the back part this time. So I'm gonna get that printed, and you can see the sort of difference of half size or 20% size and full size, but it's pretty crazy. I'm pretty pumped about it. So that's my exciting thing for the day to share. Hope everything's going okay for you. We're gonna be watching the news pretty carefully for the next couple of days. Certainly, this pandemic thing is very interesting. It's very interesting from an evolution perspective, honestly, or an ecology perspective. We're talking about spreading. In this case, we're spreading a disease, but that does have some similarities in sort of simulating the spread of things like genetics, which is how evolution spreads. So I don't know, maybe there's something to be said there. Maybe I don't want to think about it too hard. We don't want to make too many comparisons, but it is pretty wild what's going on. I'm getting more and more emails every single day about things. So some things you're going to see me try for the next little while. We're going to have these videos. These videos are going to be at noon every day as far as I'm planning. So that will be your chance to chat with me. And also I'm going to be doing the videos on here. My goal is to make it about an hour of your day. So as part of that hour, it might be half an hour of lecture and then an assignment. It might be a test. I might post a test and just give you a very quick live stream to kind of introduce it. Maybe go through a couple of pieces of the test and then let it stand there by itself so that you can do the test yourself. With tests, we're gonna have to kind of, I want to make them as authentic as we can. So I will probably give you some, tests. I hate the word tests, that. But with the authentic assessments, we'll probably be looking at like posting it on a Tuesday and expecting it done before Wednesday. And if it's not done before Wednesday, then we can't really call it authentic. So maybe it's not like a mastery, but it could show good application. So that's like a 4 versus a 3 kind of thing. So we're going to probably have to get into that next week. Probably getting, we need to probably do some assessment on this evolution unit ASAP, because we're getting a little bit deep into it and we haven't really haven't seen too much from you. It's been a lot of me talking and not a lot of listening. So we're going to get into that soon enough. And we have a little bit of a different setup today. So I do want to, we're going to have to do a little bit of work on how I'm going to angle everything. I couldn't find the same computer as last time. So hopefully you got a chance to watch Darwin's Voyage, and we're now just going to go look in our booklet and see if we have similar information and what that kind of information is telling us. So my goal was that at the beginning of the unit we talked about the evidence, like what evidence is there that life has changed that we have nowadays. Now that we've established the baseline of evidence for change, then we started to talk about, well, okay, how could that change have happened? And so that's where we discussed the convergence or divergence or even change that happens together in a similar way. Two species that are changing similarly in parallel or dissimilarly. So now we're going to say, okay, so change happens. We have evidence that things change. We have evidence that if things are changing, there's two options, or three options, I guess. The thing could change. The two different species became more different. Two species became more similar, or two species stayed equally dissimilar but also changed. And then the final step is to say, well, why? Why would change even happen? And that's the big question. That's a pretty juicy question. I mean, this is a good, like, why would we even have change? We can see it, but just because we can see it doesn't mean that it happened. We kind of need a mechanism. We need a reason why the change is happening. And so that's where we have these different theories of evolution. The mechanisms, the theory of evolution is all about mechanisms. What mechanism of evolution did we have? So I'm just going to try to do my setup here. We're going to do something like this. And as long as I don't change anything, that's kind of okay. All right, it's not the most beautiful setup in the world. We're going to have a much nicer setup when we get back to when we get into my home. I will have us set up real nice, and it's going to work real good, I hope. So there we go. All right, so there's a couple of theories that were going around at the time. In the 17th century and 18th century, we had sort of an age of reason. Essentially, what happened was that that prior to the 1700s, there wasn't really a concept of science. The idea of science is that there's something to be discovered, whereas for a lot of at least European history, it was encouraged that people not think about the unknown. People were in power, and those in power retained their power by being the voice of authority. And if there was unknown, then they couldn't have authority. So this was a common feature of Europe pre-1700s, and so this was around the 1700s, they started to realize that, if science develops, then technology develops, and if technology develops, then we can improve all sorts of other things. There's a really interesting book called *Sapiens*. I recommend it very much. It's a book that discusses sort of the history of humans, and he has a very interesting approach to explaining sort of why things ended up the way they ended up. And how sort of science and capitalism are all sort of interconnected with other ideas. So astronomy, biology, they start to be sort of made fundamental or made scientific at this time. And to say that these fields of study were maybe around, but they weren't scientific. There wasn't this concept that there was an unknown. It was, now we had this idea that, okay, well, what if there's things we don't understand? And now that we know that there's things we don't understand, what does that tell us about the universe? How does that change our approach to talking about the universe and all these sorts of ideas? So at the time, most people assumed that species were unchanging. All the same organisms were thought to have been on the Earth since the beginning of time. But if this was the case, that didn't explain fossils. So this early thinking was the idea of unchanging. That's not chaining. That should say unchanging or unchanging. So there was an idea of stagnancy, that all life forms already existed. We can make some connections as to why that might be, but I don't want to make those today. But So Jean Lamarck was a scientist of sorts, early naturalist at least. So he studied nature, and he thought about this, and he said, well, what if organisms could respond to their environments? What if as the environment changed, organisms would respond and change with that environment? This is an incorrect theory, but so I do want to keep our eyes out. This is bad. This is an incorrect theory. So don't get held up on this. So that's my warning. So he said, okay, what if things responded to their environment? And this seemed pretty good idea. Each organism we come across in nature seems pretty well adapted to their environment. It seems like they're able to live in their environment, and they live in their environment very well. They don't feature, most organisms don't feature, don't have features that don't ensure survival. You don't see any birds that have to capture bugs for food. You don't see any of those birds being born with big fat bodies so that they can't chase the bugs, right? Bug-eating birds are born with light bodies that can catch up to bugs, and they might have they have special beaks that are able to catch the bugs. The organisms have traits that seem to help them survive. So for Lamarck, he said, well, okay, so what if as the environment changes, the organisms respond by changing to it? Sounds good, but it's wrong. But it's good. It's a good idea. It has some holes in it, and we'll get into that. So his idea was that somehow an organism would recognize the traits around the traits it needed, and it would change to respond to the ones that it needed. Now, of course, he failed to find evidence to support his hypothesis, because we know that changes we know today that changes in an organism come from changes in the DNA. But changes in the DNA are very rare, and they're also random usually. Usually, these changes are rare and random. So with rare and random mutation, it seems almost impossible for an organism to respond to the environment, and at least in the time of its life. This makes it impossible. Let's say near impossible. Makes it near impossible for the organism to have this type of responsive Now there are some, maybe there's some caveats to this. We could imagine that that if the environment was particularly mutagenic, if it was an environment that had a lot of mutations happening all the time, maybe there would be the occasional organism born with a new trait or gains a new trait while it's alive that helped it survive. But this isn't really the concept that Lamarck was dealing with. He wanted this idea. He had this very simplistic view that we would have a short-necked giraffe who spends its life chewing on really tall leaves, and then because it keeps stretching its neck, and because of every day it spends its day stretching its neck, its offspring would have longer necks. And over many generations of spending their day all day long with their necks up, they eventually become entirely born with this natural long neck trait. I think when you put it in those terms, this idea suddenly becomes very goofy, as it should. It doesn't really, I can play basketball all day long, but it doesn't make my son able to play basketball better. Right? I could try to eat chunks of wood every single day, and I could feed my son, a bunch of wood chips every day, and then I would feed my grandchildren wood chips. It doesn't mean that in a couple of generations, my family line is going to be able to digest cellulose. No, my family is just going to have a really weird habit where they keep getting splinters in their mouths, and people will keep telling them to stop eating wood. So this does not seem to fit with what we know about DNA now. That changes are random and rare. So if changes are random and rare, then how does change spread across a gene pool? Well, this is where we get into Charles Darwin. So he's another naturalist. You've watched a video on him hopefully by now. Born in England, he became a doctor, but he had some interest in natural history. He does a couple other things. He has a botanist friend, John Henslow, and he shares his name with a captain, Robert Fitzroy, who is the captain of the HMS Beagle. And on the Beagle, he gets to set sail for England. If you're interested, you can find copies of all of his journals and journal articles. So Darwin's notebook, that's it. So this is a notebook. It's, I believe this is the one. Let's see. I believe this is news. Oh no, maybe this is not the one. Okay. There was one that has like Darwin's journal. And I believe it has all of his, I believe in here you can see, so in this example you can see a bunch of, you can see on Darwin Online, darwin-online.org.uk, you can see manuscripts. There's some really cool images of his finches that he drew. It doesn't want to, oh, there it is. So you can see some of his drawings. He as an early biologist, they didn't have a functioning camera or a camera that could work efficiently. So he spent a lot of time taking his pictures by hand, having to draw them, and his pictures, I guess. So you can see him drawing the different shapes of butterflies and moths and things, making note of the patterns that he's seeing as he travels around the world. This is looks like London, you can see lots of really cool stuff. And I believe that many of his pictures are up here. So here's his illustrations here, yeah. And so there's some really amazing zoology of the voyage of the HMS Beagle. You can see him taking sketches of different skulls he saw. Here's a fossil that he found during the years of 1832 and 1836. Here's some bone structures he took sketches of from mammal fossils. Oh, I don't want two of these. Okay. You've got all sorts of different things. So he was exploring all sorts of ideas. Here's the zoology he saw, so seeing some dolphins and some foxes. Notice his interest in all of these similar fox species, or similarities in foxes, similarities in mice and shrews that he found at various points. And comparisons. And he starts to notice these comparison of forms. As he draws these pictures, he realizes like, oh well, these organisms, even though they're from different continents and different places around the world, around the globe, they all have sort of similarities in their shapes. So here's some more birds, etc. So really a fun website. I highly recommend it. I will put a link on our classroom blog there. Copy that and put that on our blog, whatever we call this. Maybe I'll put that in materials, projects. Put that Darwin Online. Yeah, so that's that, and we'll put that in, I don't know, books, notes, handouts, sure. Okay, let's get back into it. So he sets off on this trip. He does this amazing trip around the world, which the map is missing. I used to have a map in here, I feel like, but that's okay. Let's get a map out. So let's go Darwin's Voyage. So it's a pretty impressive trip. Look at to travel this far in the. Can I just get a copy? Come on. There we go. Okay, get out of here. Okay, so here we can see the trip. There we go. Traveling around the globe. Something a few years before would have been almost impossible to do successfully. Even this trip, they lost tons of, they lost supplies and all sorts of samples and things over their trip. But here they traveled from the UK through to South America, around South America to the Galapagos, and then through to Australia, Sydney, and on into these islands in the middle here of this ocean, and then to the south, to the tip of Africa, and then back over to South America, and then back through. So an amazing trip. Took a very, very long time. What was the trip's length? Does anybody remember? 5 years. There we go. That's on the next one. So it was a 5-year trip, and but there was a bunch of time that he spent on the Galapagos Islands, a very interesting set of small islands that are all very closely linked, close in proximity to each other, close enough that it seems that things like finches and tortoises and iguanas have at different times been able to travel between the islands, and then spread, and then get sort of trapped on those islands and differentiate, so to evolve differently on those different islands. When he collecting his fossils, he identified some really interesting fossil bones. There was the gigantic sloth. We have a copy of the gigantic sloth in our own museum. Gigantic sloth. It has a better name, but this is the animal here. So this was a type of sloth that would have been alive in the past, and the Megatherium is the word. And we actually have a reproduction in our own museum of Megatherium, and I just want to see some bones. Here it is. This is Megatherium bones here. We have this a similar model, a little bit different. He's sort of standing up in our own Manitoba Museum, and it looked like this. And when you look at it, you see a lot of interesting similarities to the sloth of today. And so that was one of these pieces where looking at this Megatherium bone, Darwin said, "Whoa, wait a second, that looks like a sloth. Could it be that sloths have changed over time?" And this is before the idea of evolution really had made concrete ground. So looking at it and saying like, hey, not only these fossils interesting and weird, unusual. They don't look like animals we have today. They do, you know, they are important to, no, I don't want that. I want to just get the picture. Okay, I don't need nature is metal here. Okay, just want this giant, I want to drop a giant sloth. Does not want to let me go. Okay, it was this idea of change, right? Change over time. Could it be, you know, these weird fossils they're discovering of dinosaurs and the like? What if they aren't all creatures we don't have today? So things like the Megatherium looks like a creature we have today. What if there was a mechanism by which a giant sloth could slowly become a small, normal-sized sloth, one that we see every day? Maybe not every day, but one that we've seen still living today. So there's also a giant armadillo one that we also have a copy of at our museum. So this suggested that there might be some sort of link between these ancient forgotten species and the current species of today. So possibly that there could be change over time, right? This could be change over time. So this was his hint towards evolution. He also found that there was variation in living forms. So when he looked at the finches on various islands, he said, hey, you know, it's interesting that if we look at all these finches between the different islands, they all have little differences. And then even if we looked at just one type of finch, looking at, you know, only ground finches, we still would notice that there are differences between individuals. So even within the same species, even within the same species, there were differences. And so that's very interesting. That's a very interesting conclusion, because if even within the same species there's all these differences, then that might be a place where change could happen. That means that there's changes between individuals. Something we have an idea about, right? And there's no two humans that are born alike except for identical twins. So we all have unique DNA. So every individual has a unique appearance, a unique phenotype, which is going to be very interesting. So Alfred Russel Wallace, he developed his own theory during an 8-year voyage around Indonesia, and he sent an original paper to Darwin in 1955, prior to his publication of Origin of the Species, although it was partially written. Together they wrote a paper about the theory of evolution and natural selection. This paper was sent out in 1958, and then Darwin published his book, which is in 1959. So the interesting thing about science, especially at this time, was that a book had a higher potential for being read, you know, or being spread. Books like Darwin's book is still published and available today. His paper is also still available, but maybe not as easily accessible. But you can definitely you can get Darwin's book for $5 at Indigo in their sort of their open source book area there. So his book is well out of print, well out of copyright. So they have these little $15 books, paperbacks, and you can get a copy of Darwin's Theory of Evolution. So the book has lasted a lot longer because Wallace is not on the book. We often hear Wallace not being as mentioned, or you know, some students might never even learn Wallace's name, Alfred Wallace's name. I personally always forget Alfred part, because when I was a student I didn't learn about him at all. But without his influence, the theory probably would not have been as strong. I've come to learn that Alfred Wallace has sort of a mathematical perspective, and applied some of these statistical ideas to the theories, and that gave the theory that life could change more credence, because if we start to consider the statistics of organisms and the number of differences they have, the chance of change is higher. Shouldn't it be 1858? Is that for the book? I believe that 1858 is the publication of the paper, and 1859 is the publication of the book. But I could be wrong. Origin of the species. Origin of species. Yeah, 1859 for Origin of the Species, and his original paper is 1858. So first published as a paper. I don't know how long the paper was, but obviously the book is quite intense. It's quite a thick read. Let's see. Initial theory. There's a typo on page 34. 33, page 34. Oh. Sent his original paper in 1855. Together they wrote the initial paper in 1958. That's correct. And then the book was published in 1859. I don't think that's an error. (1858), the Darwin-Wallace paper is published. So, yeah, this was this sent his original paper in 1855. That's Wallace sending his copy of his paper that hadn't been published yet to Darwin, and then they worked together to finalize and write their 1958 paper. I'm not sure if Wallace wrote, maybe that's Wallace wrote a paper 1855. Oops, not 1955. What is going on? Oh, great. Don't want that. Okay. Sliding around here. Alfred Wallace here. Oh yeah, so Alfred Wallace does have a paper from 1855. It looks like polymath. Yeah, he was incredibly good at, famously, lesser well known as Wallace's Darwinian essay of 1855, in which he marshaled geological and biogeographical evidence to show that species creation is an unlikely cause of observed species distribution. So species creation was the idea that species would spontaneously be created, and he was able to counter that point. Third point in paragraph should say 1958. Oh, 1850. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Sure. Fine. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So yeah, they definitely did not live another 100 years and publish a paper. I see. Anyway, so Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, that eventually, some of this is a little bit transmuted, or we're doing a little bit of advancing his theory from his original ideas over to the modern vocabulary that we're going to use, but we're going to kind of explain some ideas here. So his idea was largely that evolution occurs within a population because of the variation between individuals. giving some an advantage to reproduce over others in the presence of an environmental stress. So what this is, what we can break this down, right? Environmental stress, this means that the environment is dangerous. So not all survive. So if not all your individuals are surviving, and that there is some difference between them, there are differences, then under an environmental stress, some of those that survive are surviving because of their differences. So you've got a group of organisms. Some of them are better at surviving than the others. And so those ones have a slight advantage. Now, we're not talking about 100%. We're not saying that there's, only 1 out of 100 is surviving. We're saying that out of 100, there are some of them that are some of them have a higher chance of survival. Maybe they have a 95% chance of survival, whereas somebody without the trait has a 94% chance of survival. And if we do this, if we apply this difference over enough generations, then the organisms will start to have a phenotype that is they will start to have that phenotype as the dominant type. So those phenotypes that more frequently reproduce will have a greater presence in the population. An evolution of traits in the population will have occurred. Right? So in this case, we're saying that there are differences. So individuals don't all survive. And their differences may give them a better chance of surviving. Over time, the survivors pass on more genetic material to the next generation. Now, we are not stipulating that only those with the trait survive. We're saying that having whatever this trait is, that this beneficial trait, will increase your chance of survival. And by increasing your chance of survival, then over time, statistically, so on the large scale, that trait will be more common. And this can be tricky to wrap your head around. No problem. Thanks for catching that typo. I'll try to get it on the next edition of this booklet. I have a bit of a problem reading my own writing. As I type it, I just sort of I don't see my own mistakes. So it can be, even when I was reading it, I couldn't see the 1958. It just was, my brain was auto-fixing. Okay, so yeah, so individuals don't all survive, and their differences may give them a better chance of surviving. Over time, the survivors are the ones who pass on the genetic material. So the next generation looks more like the oh, actually, we want to say more like more like the individuals with the, we'll use the word adapted trait. What might have been a random difference could eventually become an important difference, because those ones with the trait that is helping them survive are the ones that are reproducing more often. Now, Darwin couldn't explain this. Like the idea fit, and it fit his observations. So it was a great, maybe even a hypothesis. It probably was a good theory because it had lots of examples. But even at this time, it would be difficult to call it a strong theory. It's now very strong because we've made lots of observations since that point, and we've made lots of observations of natural selection occurring on different species, and it being an efficient way of causing evolution. Remember, we're talking right now about what are the causes of evolution. We already established that there's lots of evidence that life changed, but now why? Why would the life change? So we can explain something like the origin of variation. This origin of variation comes from the idea that everyone carries a unique set of DNA. So origin of variation comes from our unique DNA. And then transmission, how does one generation gain these traits from the next? This is also something Darwin didn't have in his back pocket. We didn't have the concept of inheritance. But we know that changes in DNA may be inheritable, are inheritable. In reproduction. So now I know that only some changes are inheritable and some aren't, but let's not quibble too much on that. So these two points solved all of his problems that he would have had. I mean, it would have been an amazing thing to have Darwin come today and see like all the new ideas that we have and all the new observations we made that to prove this theory was much more than a theory, or much stronger maybe than he could have even expected or predicted. So there are 4 caveats to this evolutionary change by natural selection: overproduction, competition, variation, adaptation, and then speciation would be the byproduct. So we're going to go through these. I think what I might do at this point is post a video for the next section, give you the sort of the last little bit of class here to watch a video on this. I have a couple. I suppose we could watch them together and then I can make commentary. I hadn't thought about that. Let me see if I can. Is that weird, or am I stealing information at that point? If we're commentary, I want to pull up my evolution channel. Let's go to my channel. So I do have if you can get it to my playlists, I have a lot of different playlists, but some of them you won't be able to see. But my biology playlist, I believe that I have a public evolution playlist, which I feel is quite strong, has some good stuff in it. Here, evolution and gene editing. So there's 24 videos in there. If you can, if you want to direct yourself to that playlist, it's a very good playlist of things. Some of them we've already watched, and some of them we'll watch later. This Kurzgesagt video is great. This one is a very thorough sort of. It uses a little bit of a higher language level, but as they're prone to do, but. It's still not quite all the videos I was looking for. I'm actually looking for a different one, so let's just type a natural selection. I know the video I'm looking for is this one, Stated Clearly. So both these Amoeba Sisters one and the Stated Clearly one are very good. So I will post the entire playlist to the classroom, but I will also draw your attention to these. Where is evolution? 40S lectures. Evolution and gene editing. Okay. And then the playlist. Okay. Oh, got moved to the top. Great. And there's also, there's lots of different videos if you want to watch this. All of these, BioInteractive is a very good website. You can see that I got that from there. We should probably watch this genetic video on genetic drift and that versus natural selection. No, we don't want to watch that. We don't want to watch that. And we don't want to watch any of these. Okay. If you want to watch some sort of more science history courses, then this crash course is probably a good one. I love this. This video is great as well. I believe we watched this before, but I'm just going to make sure that's on that playlist because that is one of the most important videos we can ever watch. This is direct observation of evolution by natural selection. So, yeah, and this probably is good too. Okay, let's put that in there too. Okay, that's probably enough for that video list. So let's see. So I'm going to highly recommend that we watch this video here together. If you'd like the more simple language, then the natural selection one is also very good.
This episode of Stated Clearly was only
so
possible
maybe I'll do a little commentary here.
And from Brain Tools LLC, a company dedicated to developing and delivering to patients
Probably should let them
new treatments for Alzheimer's.
get their clicks.
Stated Clearly presents, what is natural selection? Natural selection is one of several key concepts contained within the theory of evolution. To understand exactly what natural selection is and why it's so important, let's first take a quick look at two other evolutionary concepts.
Just going to read the chat for a second. If it's on, it's not plagiarism. I hope so. I also think I'm allowed to do commentary on things as a sort of me commenting on this video will not be plagiarism as long as I'm over talking it. Someone did spend time making it, so I don't want to completely steal it.
And the overarching idea of common descent. Descent with modification is the observable fact that when parents have children, those children often look and behave slightly different than their parents and slightly different than each other. They descend from their parents with modifications. The differences found in offspring are partially due to random genetic mutations. Common descent.
Okay, so I also really like these videos. They do a really good job of putting some really clever animation in. So looking at these 4 offspring, notice that they even went through the effort to make them so that they're all unique. This is one of the properties of reproduction, is that in reproduction, it is almost impossible to have 2 offspring that are not twins be born with the similar traits. So, so this is one of the sources of variation that we can say that Darwin was looking for in his studies. He didn't understand where the variation was coming from, but now understanding genetics and inheritance much better, almost fully understanding them, we understand that all children are remixes of their parents plus random mutation.
Modifications. The differences found in offspring are partially due to random genetic mutations. Common descent is the idea that all living things on Earth are related. They descended from a common ancestor. Through the gradual process of descent with modification over many, many generations, a single original species is thought to have given rise to all the life we see today. The common descent of all life on Earth is not a directly observable fact. We have no way of going back in time to watch it happen. Instead, common descent is a conclusion based on a massive collection of facts. Facts found.
I like inference, but I won't debate them too much on that. So It's an inference or a conclusion, an idea that we can extract or extrapolate from the concepts of natural selection and the theories of evolution.
Found independently in the study of fossils, genetics, comparative anatomy, mathematics, biochemistry, and species distribution. Because the evidence for common descent is so overwhelming, the concept has been around since ancient times. In the past, however, it was rejected by many philosophers and scientists for one main reason. You cannot get order and complexity from random chaos alone.
So this is a concept we haven't talked about, because I do try to avoid leaning too heavily on the concept of common descent. I like the pure ideas of evolution and allowing my students to come to the conclusion that common descent is a very strong theory that is strongly accepted by all biologists. But I don't want to force it on you. I would like you to come to that conclusion yourself. But one of the strong dissenting points against common descent is this idea: you cannot get order from chaos. But this is where natural selection is really powerful theory to understand. It puts some limits on chaos. We're going to be putting on, this is where the whole concept of a stress is really important, because the stress on this chaotic change is going to push the chaos in a specific direction so that we can get complexity from stress.
Bodies and behaviors of living things are extremely complex and orderly. Descent with modification simply produces random variation. All through history, no one could explain how complex life arose from simple life through random variation until Charles Darwin discovered natural selection. Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, was a naturalist, someone who studies nature. At the start of his career, he traveled the world by ship, collecting and documenting plants and animals. During his travels, Darwin became very interested in the idea of common descent. He noticed that islands contain species of plants and animals unique to those islands. They can't be found anyplace else on Earth, but they often look and behave surprisingly similar to creatures found on nearby continents. Tortoises on the Galapagos Islands can be distinguished from those of Africa. Meanwhile, with the exception of size, they're almost identical to a species found nearby in South America. Darwin believed these similarities could be best explained through common descent. Long ago.
So this is again the type of evidence we would call biogeographical evidence. So this is the comparison of forms over a difference in geography. And that comparison of forms and geography informs us something about the relationship between the two. So it's very fascinating that this species here, shares these traits between the other two species, but is smaller. So, is this the original species and the other two are offshoots? Or is this one over here the original species and these two are offshoot species? This is something we can explore now that we realize that the change that they've undergone seems to be related to the distance and the placement around the globe.
Well, a tortoise from the mainland may have drifted to the islands, possibly on a raft of storm debris, and once arriving, laid her eggs. Random changes caused by descent with modification over thousands of years eventually transformed the island creatures and the mainland creatures so much that they could no longer be considered the same species. This idea made good sense to Darwin, except for one thing. The island creatures he found weren't just randomly different from their mainland cousins. They were specially adapted for island life. The Galapagos is a collection of 18 main islands, many of which are home to tortoises. The larger islands have lots of grass and vegetation. Tortoises there grow extra heavy and have dome-like shells. Some of the smaller islands have very little grass, forcing the tortoises to feed on island cactus. The best cactus pads grow on the tops of these plants. Fortunately, Tortoises on these islands are equipped with expanded front legs and saddle-like shells, allowing them to stretch their necks extra long to reach their food. It's almost as if these...
So now we're talking about a change that's not random, but directed, right? So this is why this is a really important idea, because in the difference between generations, generation by generation, we would expect the changes to be random, but over a number of generations, over a long period of time, these differences seem to be going in a specific direction. We're going from the regular domed shell to the saddle shell, or there must have been some progress to move them, because we know in general tortoises have these domed shells, and so this direction towards the saddle, it must have come over time.
These island creatures have been perfectly sculpted to survive within their unique environments. How did this sculpting take place? Random descent with modification alone could never do such a thing. Darwin drew upon his knowledge of selective breeding to answer this question. For thousands of years, farmers have been taking wild plants and animals, and through the process of selective breeding, have sculpted the original wild forms into new domestic forms, much better suited for human use and consumption. The process is slow but simple. If a single plant produces 100 seeds, most will grow to be nearly identical to the parent plant. A few, however, will be slightly different. Some variations will be undesirable, smaller size, bitter taste, vulnerability to disease, and so on. Other variations will be highly valued. Thicker, sweeter leaves, for example. If a farmer only allows the best plants to reproduce and create seeds for the next crop, small positive changes will add up over multiple generations, eventually producing a dramatically superior vegetable. You might be surprised to hear that broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are all just different breeds of a single type of weed commonly found along the shores of the English Channel. The evolution of this original plant into all the varieties we see today was carefully guided by different farmers around the world who simply selected for different traits. It's important to note that the farmer doesn't actually create anything. Random descent with modification creates new traits. The farmer simply chooses which of those new creations are allowed to reproduce and which are not.
Okay, so super key point there, right? Changes are random between generations, but survival, or in the case of artificial selection, reproduction particularly, it might not be random, or is not entirely random. So especially in artificial selection, when we're trying to domesticate an animal or a plant, it does not have to be a random event. Artificial selection, we are controlling who gets to reproduce. So now what if, Darwin proposes, what if there is a non-random mechanism for controlling reproduction in the wild?
Darwin proposed that nature itself is also capable of selection. It may not have an intelligent brain like a farmer, but nature is an extremely dangerous place in which to live. There are germs which can kill you, animals that can eat you. You could die of heat exhaustion. You could die of exposure to the cold. When parents produce a variety of offspring, nature, simply by being difficult to survive in, decides which of those variations get to live and reproduce, and which do not. Over multiple generations, creatures become more and more fit for survival and reproduction within their specific environments. Darwin called this process natural selection. Since Darwin first put forth his idea in the mid-1800s, natural selection has been studied and witnessed numerous times in nature and in the science lab. What started out as a mere idea is now officially an observable fact. Darwin's discovery has greatly expanded our understanding of the natural world. It's led to countless new breakthroughs, and it finally allowed scientists to seriously consider the idea of common descent. So to sum things up, what exactly is natural selection? Natural selection is the process by which random evolutionary changes are selected for by nature in a consistent, orderly, non-random way. Through the process of descent with modification, new traits are randomly produced. Nature then carefully decides which of those new traits to keep. Positive changes add up over multiple generations. Negative traits are quickly discarded. Through this simple, ongoing process, nature, even though it does not have a thinking mind, is capable of producing incredibly complex and beautiful creations. I'm John Perry, and that's natural selection stated clearly.
Okay, so great animation. I definitely can't make that myself. Hopefully you find that useful. So we taking the random changes that happen every generation and then applying some sort of stress. So in the case of those bugs, some of those bugs are brown, some of those bugs are green. The brown ones in a green environment have a lower chance of survival. They might still survive, but their chance is lower than the ones that are green. Those surviving green bugs, they go on to have babies. Their babies are mostly going to be green. They might be carrying the brown gene, but they're probably not. So over time, their gene pool is going to change towards that green color. So hopefully that's been helpful. We will talk again on Monday. Class is still at 12 o'clock. Things are looking like we are definitely going to be off. At the very least, we're going to be off for the next week. And then hopefully we'll be coming back. But from the news reports that we're getting, it looks like we might be doing this sort of format for a while. So let me know if you have any problems. Always feel free to email me. We're going to try to do an in-class or a class meeting on Google Meetings next week. I'll post that into our Google Classroom, and you can join me there. And that'll be our class on the 12th. We'll do another couple of these videos, watching them together, watch-alongs. I guess they're going to be little YouTube parties. And then we'll also do the live streams for the whole class time. So every day, 12 o'clock, I want to see you here. And if you want to shout out, make sure I know that's you. That'd be great too. Otherwise, we'll see you next week on Monday. Have a great weekend. You might see an assignment or something show up online. If not, there's at least the Darwin assignment. It's already up there. I'd love to see your thoughts on who Darwin was and what is your idea for. Or what is your sort of way of writing out natural selection? Try for nothing too crazy. I don't need to see 10 pages on what natural selection is, but a page or a couple of sentences. That'd be great. Okay, good luck, and we'll talk to you on Monday.